I'm excited for this season of Rocket Motivation because my firm, Hand, Arundel, Harris & Sale, Attorneys at Law, where I am a partner, is our sponsor. We understand life and running a business can be challenging, but with the right support, it can also be incredibly rewarding. That's why we're thrilled to announce our partnership with Hand, Arundel, Harris & Sale.
One of the first things that I think we all have to face is acceptance of where we're at and acceptance of what's ahead. And once we can kind of get to that place, then the next step would be, all right, let's tackle this.
Hey everyone, this is Rod Cate and welcome to Rocket Motivation Podcast. This week's guest is a former gambling addict. She's going to tell the story of her addiction, hitting rock bottom, and how she has overcome her addiction. She has a website and a podcast called The Broke Girl Society, both of which were created for women struggling with problem gambling, provide them help and support. It's going to be a great episode. Christina Cook, welcome to Rocket Motivation Podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Well, Christina, let's do this. Kind of tell us where you are now in your life, kind of what you do, family, just whatever you want. Just kind of catch us up.
All right. I just passed 1,000 days bet-free. So that would have been March of 2021, but 1,000 days bet-free. And in that time, I have focused on my own recovery, but I focused on the Broke Girl Society podcast and support group that we have. I live in Oklahoma, and I have 2 dogs and 2 cats and a great partner. And life is actually really good for me these days.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's do this. Go back. Tell us about kind of when you were first introduced to gambling, that part of your life, how you first realized you had an addiction problem. So basically, I'm just opening the floor. Just tell us your story.
All right. It's always so hard to kind of like put my story together. I tell it so many times in so many different ways, but I'll just kind of start where I am in Oklahoma. We have 143 casinos. They're everywhere. And I know some states have it worse, other states, better, but here it's casino gambling. We do not have online gambling. We do not have sports betting yet. So back in the early 2000s, when Oklahoma passed the law for tribes to be able to build casinos, that was probably early 2000s. And so I really kind of didn't have much experience with gambling beforehand. Like it's not something that my family did. We had the 2 racetracks, I think, in Oklahoma prior to that and bingo, but it's not something I really had like experience with. And so I didn't really have experience with addiction at all. Nobody in my family really struggled with addiction aside from like nicotine. And so, this isn't something that I came in aware of. So when gambling started in the early 2000s, I maybe went once or twice. I even went to Vegas a couple of times, and it was just never my thing, which this is always the thing that always gets me is like, I was never really interested in it, right? It was like smoky and stinky and dark and like, who could have fun in that, right? So I apologize. I'm just getting over a cold, but I found myself at the age of 28 divorced, and I didn't have kids. All my friends were married, having babies. They were in that stage of their lives. And here I was single. I wasn't somebody for the bars. And I had gone to the casino as like girls' nights and things like that. And I thought, that might be a safe place to go spend a couple hours. There's security. It's well lit. To go spend a couple hours, be social and, kind of do that. And so, yeah, that was the beginning. And I would say for probably the next 5 years, it was entertainment. It wasn't necessarily problematic. It wasn't necessarily great, but it wasn't necessarily like I was spending a lot of time up there, any extra money, but it hadn't quite like tripped over that problematic line. And then I found myself around 35. I had been in a really abusive relationship, and it wasn't abusive in the form of physical, it was mental and verbal. And I didn't know how to protect myself from that, because it's like trying to say, well, he's not hurting me per se, but he's hurting me per se. And I didn't know how to fight against that. I didn't know how to talk about it. And so, that was right around 35. And I started to really just lean into the gambling as a coping mechanism. When I was there, I wasn't thinking about everything else. I wasn't hurting. I was just escaping. And so right around 35 is when it started to become problematic. I started spending bill money. I started, lying. I started just avoiding everybody. And because I was just ashamed of not only the fact that I couldn't manage my own life and I couldn't protect myself from somebody who was hurting me, And so it was like this whole like self-worth, self-destruction. It was just this chaotic thing. And gambling just really, really allowed me to kind of escape it, and it takes coming out of it to understand, the harm that gambling really played into. But yeah, so from about 35 to about 42, it was problematic, destructive. I was lying to everybody. I was crossing lines to get money, to gamble. I was doing, there was just behaviors that were never a part of me. And all of a sudden it was like, that was all of me. And so I just became really sick and tired. I had gotten out of the abusive relationship and into another relationship that was in itself not abusive, but dysfunctional. And it's just one of those things where I was just so sick and tired of being sick and tired. And the last night that I placed a bet, I had tried to stop about 2 months prior, and I made it about 60 days cold turkey. I didn't know anything about recovery. I didn't know anything about help. I didn't even know that gambling could be harmful. I still at that point was just like, I just can't afford to gamble anymore. And I had gone cold turkey, and then something happened, and I just thought I was able to quit. I was able to hold back. I think I can control it now. And so I went and I gambled, and it started a week-long binge, undoing everything I'd done in the last 60 days. And it was at the end of that week, I had spent every penny I had. I'd spent every penny of my husband at the time's paycheck. Like I had spent everything, right? And I owed everything. And I was just sitting in my car, and I'd already been struggling with like thoughts of self-harm, like maybe everybody would be better off if I wasn't here. I had even thought about how I would do it. And I was really in those thoughts when I was sitting in my car, and it was a little bit past midnight on March 6th of 2021. And I went to pick up my phone because I knew I would have a lot of missed calls because I was so MIA the whole week. And a picture of my mom that's on my background on my phone, my mom and my sisters at my sister's wedding, really just was very bright. And I remember looking at it, and I was like, I can't do this to them. Like, even though I've put them through so much and I've caused so much harm, I know they love me, and I know that I love them. And so it was like, I have to figure this out. And it was in that moment I realized that I didn't want to end my life. I wanted to end the addiction, and I was going to do whatever I could to do it. I was going to ask for help, which is something I hadn't really done before. I hadn't really let anybody in on the struggle of it, because how can I tell somebody I'm struggling with gambling? They're like, then just stop.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Just stop. And that's the worst thing you can say to somebody who's struggling with gambling, especially if you don't understand it or comprehend it. And, because to most people, it's a moral issue. It's a financial issue. It's a stupidity issue. It's not an addiction. And so it's I just didn't know how it was going to be received. And then, so that next morning I went to my mom and I laid it all out for her. And I said, I'm really struggling with this. I'm behind on everything. I've been lying to you when I borrow money, and I know I owe you money. And I just really just laid it out. And she's like, okay, well, I knew something was going on. I knew it probably had to do with gambling. But we're going to figure this out. We're going to get some help. And she had a friend that had gone to GA previously. And so that kind of got me into calling the GA hotline. And, I didn't have the best experience with that, but I was still going to try. Because I had to at this point. I wasn't living. I was just existing. I was just surviving. And that's not what I wanted for me.
And let me ask you this then. So before you talked to your mom about it, had anybody else noticed or observed what was going on with you and said, hey, I noticed you're at the casino a lot, something going on here, or you've been doing this to get money that that anybody that saw it, that approached you, before you actually made the decision, hey, I need to stop?
No. And it was one of those things, because again, it's that whole thought. Well, for one, there was a lot of secrecy, and I didn't tell anybody I was going to the casinos. The big joke around my friends was oh, she's off running errands again. I didn't make it a point to let anybody know. Now, my mom knew that I went to the casino because she would go with me, but she had actually was facing retirement and had pulled herself back because she started seeing a problem in herself. And my spouse at the time was struggling with his own addiction. So he was enabling my behavior by not asking any questions. He was avoiding it, right? Because shining light on what was going on with me would have shown light on what was going on with him. And then, my friends, they all just distanced themselves. This had been years in the making to get to this point. And I'd lost friendships, and the more you get into this addiction, the more you self-isolate, because it protects you more, or so you think. This is the addicted gambler's mind. And so, yeah, it was just, I was very much feeling very alone. And I'm sure people are like, recognize, well, she never commits to anything. She'll never, because I wouldn't, right? I wouldn't commit to anything because it's like I had the option to gamble and I would rather do that, you know? I stopped going to like family events and things like that. Just, just to gamble. And it's, so I think if anything, they recognized the fact that I was never around. My mom recognized the fact that I was having financial problems. My sister recognized the fact that I've had financial problems, because that's a whole nother part of this journey that we don't have time to get into. But she experienced financial harm because of me, and it was just, I was so lost. I was so off track, and I caused a lot of harm due to gambling. And in that moment, I was thinking nobody would help me at this point, right? So yeah, nobody really said anything and then after the fact, they were like, yeah, we were going to stage an intervention, kind of thing. But it was always after the fact, because sometimes when people are struggling, you don't know what to say to them, and you don't know how they're going to react. Are they going to get angry and never talk to me again? So that's what they were struggling with. They thought that I would react poorly, and I would have punished them for, it's really recognizing those behaviors. And they wanted to be in my life. They were so scared that I was going to get so mad at them that I wouldn't talk to them. And that scared them more than the direction I was going.
Right. Well, and if you could explain this, I mean, if you can put it into words, like somebody who's addicted to alcohol, I mean, they need alcohol or drugs, they need drugs. What was it? So being addicted to gambling, I mean, what was it? Because it is an addiction. It's just not like, hey, I just want to go put some bets down. I mean, you're addicted to it. I mean, what is it inside you that's actually drawing you to get back? That you just got to get to the casino, just to keep doing this gambling.
Yeah, well, it does actually, and this is what I think a lot of people don't understand if they haven't struggled with gambling. It actually changes your brain chemical, right? You're chasing that award center. The dopamine is what you're doing. So the more you gamble, the more you're building up that dopamine high. So it's like any other drug. You got to do more and more and more to chase that high. And so it's in, the medical dialogues now of an actual disorder. And because it alters your brain chemicals in the same way that drugs or addiction, other addictions do. And it causes you to get into this thing where, you hear stories that people do really crazy things for their addictions, and gambling is no different. It's not like somebody wants to wake up and say, hey, I'm addicted, right? I think I'm just going to be like, hey, I'm going to go gamble and become addicted. It's gradual, and it's you don't recognize it until it's really caused a problem.
And so, all right, you figure out, I got to get out of this addiction. So what do you do? What's your first steps? I mean, I know you talked to your mom, but how did you do it?
Yeah, for me, and this is going to be different for a lot of people, but for me, it was contacting the GA hotline, getting some information on some meetings, setting up when I'll go to my first meeting, but also in the meantime, searching online, searching for support groups, searching for just different ways that I could better understand what was going on with me and better understand how I can carve a path out. And podcasts were a huge part of that. I listened to my first podcast ever, and I'm going to give a shout out to my buddy Brian, because it was the All In Addicted Gamblers podcast. And, it was just so comforting to hear other people who had the same struggles that I was, and who were thinking in the same terms, because a gambler's mind is so different. It gets so distorted, and so we can rationalize anything to get that high. And even if it's just so out of character. And I remember my mom saying one time that she thought I should have won an Oscar for the way that I carried on lying and manipulating. And, I feel so much shame thinking about it now, but it doesn't weigh me down anymore. But yeah, so podcasts were really helpful to just kind of build that initial connection, kind of put my toe in the water and kind of better understand what I'm facing and how I can continue moving forward. And I'm just one of those people, like, even though I think there's something happened in that initial, like, I'm going to save my life here, I'm going to move on, something clicked in me that I just became tenacious about advocating for myself. Like, I was going to figure this out. I wasn't going to just give up. And which is, when I think about what I've struggled with and how I couldn't get myself out of abusive relationships and I couldn't advocate for myself prior, it just became more empowering to me to just keep moving forward. And so I went to my first GA meeting, and, that was a different experience. It was 3 older men who had had years of recovery. And so even though they were very welcoming and I really connected their story, I still walked out of that meeting knowing that I wanted female connections. I wanted another woman who understood. And even when I was searching online, I wasn't coming across a lot of women who were talking about this and struggling with this. And so I, just continued on. I got into therapy. I joined a bunch of different Facebook support groups and kept listening to the podcasts. And then I had a fellow friend in recovery reach out to me, and this was our initial contact. She had found me on social media because I started posting my journey on social media because I thought, if I'm not seeing other women doing this, then I'll do it, And so she was doing a podcast on like 12-step work and just addiction work in general. And even though gambling was part of her journey, so I went on her podcast and I loved the experience. And I thought, I think I want to do this just to journal my own experience. And so that's where the podcast started. I continued with GA. I continued, in the support groups, and I tried a bunch of different meetings, online meetings along the way, continued in therapy. And then I started the podcast. I started a Facebook group along with the podcast for women. I think we have about 1,600 women in there now. Wow. And it's just been such an amazing journey. And to get to 1,000 days bet free and to be doing what I'm doing and being able to advocate for women who can't maybe necessarily figure out how to advocate for themselves in the moment. It's just a life-changing moment. And it makes you realize everything you went through was for this reason.
Yeah. And see, what I think is interesting, of course, I'm on the outside looking in, but like you said, you went to your first meeting and there's 2, older guys in there. I think the general public, I guess I'll consider myself in the general public, when you think of somebody being addicted to gambling, you don't think of a female. I mean, I think it's some guy who's, he's got a family, but he's blowing his paycheck out on the casino, and he comes home and his wife's mad at him, and, that kind of stuff. And you just typically don't think it's women.
Yeah, but it is. And I think even nowadays when there's so much talk about sports betting and there's a lot of harm being caused by sports betting moving across the nation the way that it is. And you see, like right now, when you think of a gambler, you're probably picturing a 30-year-old guy who's struggling with sports betting. Or, what you see in the movies, the old time, like the older generation of men in the casinos playing cards. And it's like, that's kind of what media portrays. And it's like, when you do see a woman, it's usually an older retiree who got caught up. And it's like, I'm 45 years old. I started when I was 28. And I represent a vast majority of women who are middle-aged, who started, in their 20s and through their 40s. And then there's women who start at, as empty nesters or retirees because they just need to do something with their time. And, then now I'm talking to 18, 20-year-old women who are online gambling. And it's just like women who have babies at home and they're spending all their money and they're struggling to feed their kids. And they're like, why am I doing this? I love my children. I'm not a horrible person. And then you get the backlash of like, well, how could you do this? And it's like, it's just trying to bring better understanding how addiction doesn't discriminate, doesn't care what your age is. It doesn't care who you love. It doesn't care the color of your skin. It doesn't care how many degrees you have on the wall. It just cares that there's something going on in your life and you don't know how to deal with it. And gambling shows up and says, here, let me help you escape that, or any addiction. And so it's like, it's better understanding that and just kind of trying to break that stigma of gambling harm so everybody feels safe to get the help they need.
With the guests on your podcast, are there any common themes that you hear when it comes to dealing with gambling addiction?
I mean, if I had to sum up a majority of the conversations I've had, a lot of it, women are typically primary caretakers of the home, the finances. They work full-time jobs and still have to come home and take care of the family. And I'm not going to speak for everybody, right? Every situation is different. But for the most part, a lot of women think about gambling as time for them. It's time that they can kind of step away and nobody's asking them what's for dinner. Nobody's asking them, where their sock is. Nobody's saying, hey, did you get this filed? And so it's kind of, a lot of them say, hey, I've earned this time to step away and just spend on myself. And this is what I want to do. And so, the overall theme is just escapism, escaping of just, that life. A lot of times we will just give and give and give and deplete ourselves. And, we're not refilling the cup in a healthy way. And so by escaping it, you're just not feeling it, and the thing with dopamine is that like gives you a little bit of energy. It gives you a little bit of feel good. And especially if things aren't great at home or things aren't great at work. And yeah, so I think it's an easy way for somebody to say, hey, I'm just going to take some time to myself and do this. And then that's how, the harm starts to gradually increase. And I would say that's kind of the overall theme is just me time. Right. And then it ends up being a very big problem that a lot of times they hide from their spouse and loved ones.
Is it easier? Because you said you're over 1,000 days bet free. Does it get easier the further you get away from it? In other words, like, because if it's dopamine, I don't know, does your brain, does it heal itself, and does it become easier the farther you get away from it? I guess if you're on a dopamine rush all the time, well, now you're 1,000 days away, that I'm assuming you don't have the same dopamine levels. I'm not a brain doctor, so I wouldn't know. But you see what I mean? Does your brain heal itself?
Yeah.
Kind of talk about that.
Yeah. I think in those initial days, you're coming out of survival mode, and you're kind of like your emotions are all over the place. And another thing, and I won't get into it here, but another thing I like to talk about, especially for women in recovery, is like hormones and all that kind of stuff. So you're just kind of trying to figure everything out. Right. And so the initial days are fairly hard because you want to escape, and now you can't escape in the way that you've become accustomed, and you miss it, and you have to grieve it, and you have to let it go. But as you build up the days and you do the work, and I think there's a big difference between abstinence and recovery. Abstinence is just like cold turkey and it not really do anything, just not betting. Some people can manage that way, but I would say majority of people would need more of a recovery. And that's, online meetings, support groups, therapy, things like that. But yes, for me, and I can only speak for me, the further I got away from the bet, the better I felt, the stronger I felt. The urges would come and go, but they become more fleeting. They might come in like a flash, and you're able just to kick them back out like a flash. But it's definitely something I will be working at for the rest of my life. And I don't look at it like a life sentence, right? I think a lot of people are like, that's a life sentence of online meetings. I can't do that. I don't look at my recovery as a life sentence. I just look at it as my life. And if I want to continue to be healthy, have healthy relationships, have a healthy financial life balance, I need to stay focused on what's next and to keep myself from going back out. But it is something that, is always going to be in the background. Like, hey, this has been a problem before. It could easily be a problem again if you stop focusing on how to move forward. And so I think it does. And I think a lot of things that get in the way for people too is just the shame, the financial burden, if it ended a relationship, there's a lot of guilt and stuff. So it's really working on those things. For me, gambling was a symptom of the internal issues. And as I fixed the internal issues, the symptoms went away. And that's the easiest way I can explain it. But your brain does heal over time.
What have you learned about yourself through all of this?
That I can advocate for myself, that I can face some really hard stuff, that I can get through the other side of fear. There's so much I've learned about myself, and there's so much more I hope to continue to learn about myself. But one of the most important things that I've learned about myself is that it's okay to share how I feel. And if somebody doesn't agree with that or want to be in my life because of it, then that's okay too.
Right.
That's one of the most powerful things I've learned about myself.
And what advice, would you give to someone, a woman who comes to you and says, hey, I'm a gambling addict. What do I need to do just to try to get out of this?
One of the first things that I think we all have to face is acceptance of where we're at and acceptance of what's ahead. And once we can kind of get to that place, then the next step would be, all right, let's tackle this. Like, we don't get, with this struggle of gambling harm, it's not as easy as saying, okay, I'm done. There's so much work that we have to do. And that's the internal work. That's the conversations we have to have. That's a lot of it. So once you accept where you're at then it's like, what's next? And what's next would be therapy, online meetings, group meetings, GA in-person meetings. It would just start to kind of build a plan of your life. So I would recommend therapy to somebody first off, and then getting involved in meetings and support groups.
I kind of want to broaden the question out. Rocket Motivation Podcast, it's all about bringing on guests who have dealt with and have overcome adversity. What would you say, what advice would you give to somebody, just outside just the gambling addiction context, but just someone who's down on their luck or facing adversity, they need some help. What advice would you give to those people?
I would just tell them that, when I was feeling that way, I didn't think things could change, and they absolutely can change. They can change in the blink of an eye, or they can change with a lot of work and a lot of hard conversations and things like that. So we can change our circumstances, and it's not going to happen overnight because we didn't get here overnight, but it is possible to change, and we absolutely can.
And if somebody wants to listen to your podcast, find you on Facebook, how do they do it?
Yeah, they can go to, I'm sorry, my dog is being very vocal at the moment. They can go to thebrokeGirlSociety.com. There, they've got the podcast. I also do a YouTube show with my friend Brian Hatch called The Bet Free Life. They can find me at Christina at thebrokeGirlSociety.com for email and Facebook. Our group is for women, and we generally stick to that. There are a handful of fellows in the group, but for the most part, the meetings and everything are for women in recovery from gambling harm.
Okay. Well, Christina, I want to thank you so much for coming on. But I always give the guest the last or the parting shot. So if you could give us maybe one more nugget of wisdom or advice that we hadn't already talked about, something really good to take us home.
Yeah, I think the misconception of somebody who's struggling with addiction or struggling with something is that we can do it ourselves, is that we got ourselves in this position and we can fix it ourselves. And one of the most important things that I've learned is it's so much better when you have somebody walking beside you, somebody who understands, somebody who wants to see you succeed. And that is probably one of the most important things that we can do is find that support, find that connection, and lift each other up. Well,
Christina, I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great episode. I'm so glad that we got you. I found you, I don't know, about a year ago, I guess, and online, I saw actually what I was doing was I was Googling, because I thought it would be great to on my podcast to have a female who was addicted to gambling that has dealt with it and worked her way out of it. I thought that would be a great episode for my podcast, and we finally made it happen. So thank you so much for taking your time and doing this.
Yeah. And again, thank you so much for having me and let me share my story in hopes that it will help somebody listening.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. What a great episode with Christina Cook. When we think of gambling addiction, we typically think of men. It was great hearing her story and getting a female perspective on gambling addiction and her advice to overcome it. Tune in next week to another inspiring episode of Rocket Motivation Podcast. Thanks again for listening to Rocket Motivation. I want to again thank our sponsor, my law firm, Hand Arundel Harris & Self, with offices in Mobile, Birmingham, Fairhope, and Athens, Alabama, and Destin, Panama City Beach, and Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. We are uniquely situated among the Southeast major law firms to provide legal direction to clients throughout Alabama and Northwest Florida. So whether you're looking for legal advice, litigators, or simply a partner you can trust, Hand Arundel Harris & Sale is there for you. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out Hand Arundel Harris & Sale for all your legal needs. Visit our website at handfirm.com. And if you would like to get my book, Get Back Up, it's available at Amazon. Just put in Get Back Up and my name, Rod Cate, and the book will pop up. I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to Rocket Motivation wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please rate and review the shows and spread the word about Rocket Motivation to your friends. So until next time, remember, never give up and always get back up.